Eleanor had always felt like a mere spectator in her own life, watching from the sidelines as her younger sister, Chloe, took center stage. It wasn't that Eleanor didn't matter. It was just that she never truly felt seen. As a child, she yearned for her parents' approval, for their attention, for even a simple word of acknowledgement. But no matter how hard she tried, she was always overshadowed by Chloe. From the moment Chloe entered their lives, everything seemed to revolve around her. Chloe was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and the one whose every little victory was celebrated by their parents. Eleanor, on the other hand, was quietly pushed to the background, her achievements brushed aside as if they were trivial. Growing up in a family where Chloe seemed to hold the key to their parents' hearts, Eleanor couldn't help but question her own worth. She wasn't the one who made their parents proud by winning awards or acing every test. That was Chloe. Instead, Eleanor spent her childhood trying to prove herself, trying to be the daughter they could look at with pride. But the harder she tried, the more invisible she became. It wasn't as though her parents were cruel. It was more that they were oblivious, caught up in the whirlwind of Chloe's perfection. Chloe could do no wrong, and Eleanor began to wonder if that was the root of her own constant longing. The desire to be loved, to be noticed, to be valued. Their family wasn't dysfunctional in the way some families are portrayed in movies, with shouting matches and broken relationships. It was subtler, a quiet neglect that took root over time. It wasn't the loud dismissals or overt cruelty that defined their family dynamic, but rather the silences that spoke volumes. Eleanor could remember a moment from her childhood when she had asked her mother if she could join them for a trip to the park. Her mother, preoccupied with packing a bag, had brushed her off with a simple, "Eleanor, stay home and do your homework." It wasn't a harsh rejection, but it hit Eleanor like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the dismissal itself that stung, but the fact that it was so casual, so indifferent. Her mother didn't even pause, didn't even glance her way before moving on with the day. Chloe, in her usual hurry, had waved goodbye with a cheerful, "See you later." As if nothing was wrong, Eleanor stood there, watching them go, her heart sinking deeper into a pit of loneliness. She had wanted so desperately to be included, to be seen as part of the family, but instead, she was left standing in the living room, a mere afterthought. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and Eleanor knew deep down that it wouldn't be the last. Chloe was always the one who was needed, the one who mattered. Eleanor was left in the shadows, unnoticed and unimportant, and the worst part was that she had become so used to it, so accustomed to being invisible, that she no longer even knew how to ask for what she needed. Chloe, with her boundless energy and effortless charm, became the constant focus of their parents' affection. Eleanor tried to bridge the gap, to find a way to make herself visible in a family that seemed to operate solely on Chloe's whims and desires. She would share her accomplishments with the hope that maybe this time her parents would take notice. But the responses were always the same. Indifferent at best, dismissive at worst. It was as though Eleanor was nothing more than a background character in the story of her own life. She watched as Chloe reveled in their parents' praise, each word a knife to her own heart, each compliment a reminder of her place in the family. Secondary, unimportant. As Chloe got older, her attitude shifted from innocent confidence to a sense of superiority. She had learned that the world revolved around her, that her every move would be met with admiration and support. Chloe didn't need to try. She simply existed, and that was enough. The more she basked in their parents' adoration, the more dismissive she became of Eleanor. What had once been a sisterly bond between them, a simple connection built on shared experiences and childhood games, had dissolved into a one-sided relationship where Chloe took and Eleanor gave. Chloe's dismissive comments became more frequent, more biting. Eleanor would share something personal, a small victory in her life, but Chloe would brush it off with a laugh or a flippant remark. The bond they once shared was gone, replaced by an invisible wall that grew taller and taller as the years passed. It was around this time that Eleanor began to feel the weight of her isolation more acutely. As a young adult, she decided to take a job as a waitress at a local restaurant. At first, she was uncertain about her choice. The job was humble, certainly not what she had envisioned for herself, but it was all she could find. Over time, however, Eleanor found a sense of pride in the work. She wasn't exactly climbing the corporate ladder, but there was something fulfilling in the routine, in the way she could make people's day just a little bit brighter with a smile or a kind word. Yet, no matter how much she tried to find joy in her work, her family's constant devaluation of her job left her feeling small. Her mother would question her decisions, as if her daughter's job was somehow a reflection of her worth as a person. "Is this really the only thing you can do?" her mother would ask, always with a tone of disbelief, as though Eleanor had chosen the most menial task in the world. Chloe, too, would make her comments, not outright rude, but with a tone that lacked sincerity. "Being a waitress is a respectable job," she would say, but it always felt hollow, as if Chloe didn't truly care about what Eleanor was doing or how hard she worked. The lack of interest, the lack of support, created a rift between Eleanor and her family that seemed to widen with each passing year. Eleanor's job became a symbol of everything she wasn't. It was a reminder of the life she had built for herself, away from the expectations and disappointments of her family. She wasn't the successful, accomplished person they had envisioned. She wasn't the one receiving praise for big achievements or accolades. Instead, she was the one left behind, constantly striving for something more but never quite reaching it in their eyes. And yet, despite all of this, Eleanor still found herself hoping for their recognition, still yearning for the day when they might finally look at her with pride. But as the years went on, Eleanor began to see things more clearly. She began to realize that the problem wasn't with her, but with the family dynamic that had shaped her sense of self-worth. Her parents' favoritism toward Chloe, their complete disregard for her accomplishments, had shaped her identity in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. She had spent so much of her life seeking their approval, trying to fit into a mold that had never been meant for her, that she had lost sight of who she really was. The truth was, she didn't need their approval. She didn't need Chloe's validation. What she needed was to stop looking outward for love and recognition and start looking inward, to find the strength to love and accept herself for who she was, not who she thought she should be. For the first time, Eleanor began to question everything. She started to think about the sacrifices she had made to try to fit into a family that had never truly seen her. She had spent years bending over backward, trying to be what they wanted her to be, only to realize that no matter what she did, it would never be enough. The weight of this realization was both freeing and crushing. It meant letting go of the hope that her family would one day change, that they would finally see her. But it also meant embracing the possibility of a future where Eleanor could be her true self, without the need for anyone else's approval. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time in her life, Eleanor was ready to walk it. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to step out of the shadows and into her own light. The announcement of Chloe's wedding came like a bolt out of the blue, leaving Eleanor standing in a sea of confusion and hurt. It wasn't so much the surprise of the wedding itself. After all, Chloe was always the one who seemed to have everything fall into place effortlessly. No, it was the manner in which the news was delivered that left Eleanor feeling like a ghost in her own family. The news wasn't shared with her privately. No warm, heartfelt invitation or a sisterly moment of connection. Instead, it came as a passing statement, made casually at a family gathering where Chloe, in her typical self-assured manner, proudly announced, "I'm getting married." There was no prior warning, no attempt to make Eleanor feel like she was part of this significant moment. It was as though Chloe's wedding was an event for everyone else, and Eleanor was just an afterthought, a mere spectator in the narrative of her own family. Chloe's declaration was met with excitement and congratulations from the relatives, a flurry of questions and joyful exchanges. But Eleanor stood there, feeling a crushing wave of isolation. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that her sister would include her in the planning, that they would share moments of joy together, as they had done when they were children. But that was not the case. Eleanor was not included in the excitement, nor was she given the courtesy of being informed privately, as one would expect from a sister. This exclusion stung more than Eleanor was willing to admit. Her heart ached as she stood at the periphery of the family celebration, watching as Chloe effortlessly took the spotlight, basking in the attention and love that had always been her due. In that moment, Eleanor realized that her role in the family had never been one of importance. She had always been the supporting character, the one who played her part without question, but never the one who was seen or valued. It wasn't just Chloe's wedding that highlighted this painful truth, but every interaction they had ever shared. Eleanor had spent her life trying to fit into a mold that didn't belong to her, constantly seeking approval from a family that had never truly seen her. When Eleanor mustered the courage to reach out and offer her help with the wedding preparations, hoping to find some way to be involved, Chloe's response was as cold and dismissive as she had feared. Chloe replied with a curt message. "It's okay." Her indifference cutting through Eleanor like a sharp blade. There was no warmth, no invitation to be part of the process, just the unmistakable message that Eleanor's involvement was unwanted. It was a clear signal that she was still nothing more than an outsider in the world Chloe inhabited. The small spark of hope Eleanor had felt, that perhaps this time things would be different, was quickly extinguished by Chloe's careless words. Eleanor's desire to be included, to feel like she mattered, was once again dismissed as unimportant. But it was not until a few days later, when Chloe called Eleanor directly, that the full extent of the betrayal became clear. Eleanor had assumed that Chloe would ask for help, perhaps offer a more meaningful invitation to the wedding. But instead, the conversation that followed shattered her heart. Chloe, with a tone that seemed almost casual, asked, "Eleanor, can I ask you about the wedding dress?" Eleanor, eager for any opportunity to connect, replied eagerly, thinking that this might be the moment she was waiting for. But then Chloe's next words struck her with the force of a punch to the gut. "You're not invited to the ceremony," Chloe said flatly. The coldness in Chloe's voice was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. It was a clear, definitive statement that Eleanor was not to be part of the most important day in her sister's life. The reason for the exclusion when it came was as shallow and hurtful as Eleanor had feared. Chloe didn't want her soon-to-be husband, Wesley, or his family, to know that Eleanor worked as a waitress. It was a superficial, shallow reason, one that reduced Eleanor's entire existence to nothing more than her job. A job that, despite being honest and hard-earned, was beneath the standards Chloe and their parents upheld. Eleanor's mind raced as she tried to process the pain of Chloe's words. How could her own sister, the one person she had always tried to connect with, dismiss her so easily? How could she be excluded from something so important over something so trivial? The words that had come from Chloe's mouth were like daggers, each one carving away at the small remnants of hope Eleanor had left. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. The years of neglect, the subtle but constant dismissals, the feeling of being invisible in a family that was supposed to love her. The hurt ran deep, deeper than Eleanor was willing to admit. She stood there, the phone pressed to her ear, trying to find her voice, but all she could do was whisper, "Why?" Her throat was tight with emotion, but Chloe's response was heartless. "That's just the way it is," she said, as though it was perfectly acceptable to dismiss her own sister for something so trivial. "If you cared about my happiness, you would understand," Chloe added, as though Eleanor's exclusion was somehow her fault, as though it was her own failure for not meeting the standards Chloe had set. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, and Eleanor was left standing in the silence, her chest heavy with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness. She couldn't understand how Chloe could be so callous, so indifferent to her feelings. But perhaps, she thought, this was the way things had always been. She had never been enough in Chloe's eyes, never worthy of being seen as anything more than a shadow in her sister's life. Desperate for validation, Eleanor turned to her parents. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they would provide some support, that they would understand how deeply Chloe's words had cut. But when she shared the news of her exclusion with them, her father's response was one of laughter. He dismissed the entire situation as a joke, as though Eleanor's pain was laughable. "It must be some kind of joke," he chuckled, brushing aside her feelings as though they meant nothing. Her mother, on the other hand, was in complete denial. "Skylar would never say such a thing," she said, her tone filled with disbelief, refusing to acknowledge the hurt Eleanor was feeling. In that moment, Eleanor realized something that shattered her completely. Her family would never understand her pain. They would never see her for who she truly was, and they would never acknowledge the emotional wounds they had inflicted over the years. Their inability to empathize with her only deepened the sense of isolation she had already felt for so long. It was clear now, no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she would never be the daughter or sister they wanted. She would always be on the outside looking in, always trying to prove her worth to people who would never truly see her. The days that followed were filled with a sense of emptiness that Eleanor couldn't shake. The wedding, once a distant event in the future, now loomed over her like a dark cloud. It wasn't just about the ceremony or the dress. It was about the realization that her place in the family had never been secure. The hurt she felt went beyond the exclusion from the wedding. It was about the years of emotional neglect, the years of trying to fit into a family that didn't understand her, the years of feeling invisible and unimportant. But through the pain, something began to shift within Eleanor. The exclusion from Chloe's wedding, the indifference from her parents, all of it served as a wake-up call. She could no longer deny the truth. Her worth wasn't defined by her family's approval. She was more than just the job they deemed unworthy. She was more than the sister they ignored. And while the pain of the exclusion was still raw, Eleanor began to feel a sense of clarity, a realization that she didn't need to seek validation from people who would never truly see her for who she was. This moment, as painful as it was, would be the beginning of Eleanor's journey toward healing. It would be the start of her reclaiming her own identity, her own worth. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, Eleanor was ready to step away from the shadows and into the light. It was time to stop chasing approval and start living for herself. The days following the revelation of Chloe's exclusion from the wedding were filled with an unbearable mix of anger, confusion, and sorrow. Eleanor found herself questioning everything she had known about herself and her family. She had always believed that if she tried hard enough, if she worked for their love and approval, her family would eventually see her for who she truly was. But that hope had been shattered. Chloe's blatant rejection, followed by the cold indifference of their parents, left Eleanor questioning her place in the world. She had spent so much of her life living in the shadows, trying to fit into a mold that had never truly belonged to her. She had been invisible, not just to her family, but to herself. And yet, amidst the pain, a part of Eleanor began to stir. A quiet, reluctant realization that perhaps the person she had been waiting for validation from was the very person she had failed to see all along, herself. The conversation with Chloe had broken something inside her, but in the process, it had also awakened something far more powerful. For the first time, Eleanor felt the beginnings of a shift within herself, a quiet promise that perhaps this was the catalyst she had been waiting for, the moment when she would stop seeking validation from others and start finding it within herself. It was a painful realization, but one that ultimately gave her strength. No longer would she try to fit into a family that had never truly understood her. She began to see her own value, to understand that her worth wasn't tied to her family's perception of her, or to the job she had always been made to feel ashamed of. Eleanor had allowed her family's treatment of her to define her for far too long, and now, for the first time, she was ready to let go of their expectations and walk her own path. But change is never easy, and while Eleanor began to recognize her own worth, the pain of her exclusion still lingered. Her relationship with Chloe had been irrevocably damaged, and the more Eleanor thought about the years of emotional neglect, the more she realized that the bonds she had once hoped to rebuild were not only fragile, but had never been as strong as she had believed. There was a deep sense of betrayal that Eleanor could not ignore, one that ran deeper than just the wedding. It was the years of feeling invisible, of giving everything to a family that never truly saw her. It was the hollow, empty years of seeking love and recognition from people who were incapable of offering it. And yet, even in the midst of this pain, Eleanor felt a sense of relief. As she reflected on the years of her life spent trying to fit into a family that never understood her, she felt a sense of freedom. The shackles of their expectations were beginning to loosen, and Eleanor could see that this was her chance to finally break free, to start a new chapter. She had spent far too much time waiting for someone to see her. But now she realized she was the only one who needed to see herself. In the midst of this inner turmoil, a surprising revelation came from Jasper. One evening, as Eleanor recounted the events of the wedding exclusion and the betrayal she felt, Jasper, who had been quietly supportive but never fully transparent, revealed that he had been working as Chloe's wedding planner. The revelation was a shock to Eleanor, and for a moment she was consumed by a wave of hurt. How could he have kept this from her? How could he have been part of something so deeply painful without telling her? Jasper's explanation was full of hesitation. He had chosen to remain silent not out of deceit, but because he knew how deeply the situation with her family hurt Eleanor. He hadn't wanted to add to her pain by revealing his involvement in Chloe's wedding. His decision to withhold the truth was made in the hope that Eleanor wouldn't have to endure the emotional weight of knowing that someone so close to her was working on the event that had caused so much pain. Eleanor listened, her heart heavy with the complexity of it all. Part of her felt betrayed by Jasper, feeling as though he had kept something from her that she had every right to know. But another part of her understood his intention. He had been trying to protect her, trying to shield her from further heartache. The conflicting emotions inside her were overwhelming. But as she reflected on the situation, Eleanor began to see the truth more clearly. Jasper had never meant to hurt her. He had simply been trying to navigate a difficult situation without making it worse. His love for her was evident in his actions, and although his silence had caused her pain, it had also given her the opportunity to take a step back and reflect on what truly mattered. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to change. She started to distance herself from her family, not in anger, but in recognition that they were never going to offer her the love and support she so desperately needed. The weight of their rejection was heavy, but Eleanor knew that she could not continue to seek approval from them, not when it came at the cost of her own happiness. She began to focus on the people who mattered, on the relationships that truly nourished her spirit. She turned to Jasper for comfort, for understanding, and together they began to build a new life. It wasn't an easy decision, and the pain of her family's rejection never fully went away. But Eleanor knew it was necessary. She couldn't keep trying to force herself into a mold that was never meant for her. She needed to let go of the toxic expectations that had weighed her down for so long and embrace the freedom that came with defining her own worth. As the days passed, Eleanor and Jasper grew closer, their bond deepening as they navigated this new chapter of their lives together. The sense of security that had eluded her for so long was finally within her reach, and Eleanor began to see that love was not something she needed to earn from her family. It was something she could give herself, something she could nurture within her own heart. She wasn't just a daughter, a sister, or a waitress. She was a woman in her own right, deserving of happiness, respect, and love. Eleanor and Jasper moved to a new city, far from the family that had always made her feel small and invisible. It was a fresh start, a chance for Eleanor to finally live the life she had always wanted, without the constant weight of rejection and judgment. She threw herself into building a life filled with meaning and purpose, no longer constrained by the expectations of a family that had never truly understood her. The emotional scars from her past remained, but they no longer defined her. With Jasper by her side, Eleanor began to rebuild, piece by piece, the woman she had always been beneath the layers of pain and self-doubt. There were moments of doubt, of course. Eleanor would often find herself reflecting on the past, questioning the choices she had made and the relationships she had lost. But in those moments of uncertainty, she found solace in the love and support that Jasper offered. Together, they created a life based on mutual respect, trust, and understanding. Eleanor no longer needed her family's approval to feel worthy. She had learned to love herself, to find peace within herself, and to know that she was enough, just as she was. As the months passed, Eleanor's sense of self grew stronger. She learned to let go of the past, to release the hurt and disappointment that had held her captive for so long. The shadows of her family's rejection no longer haunted her. She was free, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor felt a sense of peace. She was no longer the person she had once been, the one who sought validation from others. She had become someone who knew her own worth, someone who loved herself fully and completely. Eleanor's journey had been long and painful, but it had led her to a place of profound self-discovery. She had learned that the most important relationship she would ever have was the one with herself. And with that newfound understanding, she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. knowing that she was capable of handling anything life threw her way. Her story wasn't just about overcoming rejection. It was about finding the strength to embrace who she was, to stop looking to others for approval, and to create the life she had always dreamed of. Eleanor had learned that her happiness was not dependent on the acceptance of others. It came from within, from the courage to let go of the past and step into a future that was entirely her own. Eleanor's story is a poignant journey of self-discovery, personal growth, and emotional liberation. From the beginning, she was caught in the suffocating grip of her family's expectations, constantly overshadowed by her younger sister Chloe, who seemed to have everything: the admiration, the love, and the spotlight. Eleanor, on the other hand, lived her life in the shadows, desperately trying to prove herself worthy of love and recognition from the people who were supposed to see her for who she truly was. Her struggle was not one of overt neglect, but rather of subtle emotional neglect, the kind that eats away at you slowly, over years, leaving you feeling invisible and unimportant. Despite her best efforts to earn her family's approval, Eleanor was continually rejected, dismissed, and overlooked. Her parents' blind favoritism toward Chloe only intensified her feelings of worthlessness, and she began to internalize the belief that her value was tied to their validation. Her job as a waitress, something she took pride in, was mocked and belittled by her family. Her accomplishments were never enough to impress them, and she grew more and more isolated, craving love that always seemed just out of reach. The turning point came when she was shockingly excluded from Chloe's wedding, a blow that finally shattered her desire for acceptance from a family that had never truly seen her. The reason for her exclusion, her job as a waitress, was so trivial and shallow that it left Eleanor heartbroken. It was a blatant reminder that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be deemed unworthy of the kind of love and respect she so deeply longed for. The emotional devastation from the exclusion acted as a catalyst for change. It was in the moments of pain that Eleanor realized she no longer needed to seek validation from others. She began to question the foundation of her self-worth, understanding that it shouldn't be defined by her family's perception of her or by the approval of anyone else. The deeper Eleanor delved into her emotions, the more she recognized that her real journey was one of finding self-love, acceptance, and independence, all of which had been stifled for so long. She began to see that true happiness could only come from within, not from external sources of validation. Her growth wasn't instant. There were moments of doubt, pain, and confusion, especially when she discovered that Jasper, her partner, had been secretly working as Chloe's wedding planner. His silence initially hurt her, but upon reflection, Eleanor saw that his decision had been made out of love, not betrayal. Jasper's revelation led her to an even deeper realization, that she needed to stop depending on others for her sense of self-worth. It was time for her to take control of her own narrative and embrace the person she had always been beneath the hurt and rejection. Eleanor's journey was not just about overcoming the pain of family rejection, but also about reclaiming her power. She chose to walk away from the toxic dynamics of her family and forge a new path, one that was authentic and self-affirming. As she and Jasper moved to a new city, Eleanor found peace in building a life that was no longer constrained by her family's expectations. She finally understood that her happiness wasn't contingent on her family's approval. In fact, it was a life-changing realization. She didn't need to be validated by anyone other than herself. Through her experiences, Eleanor learned that personal growth comes from letting go of toxic relationships and releasing the need to seek approval from those who do not truly see or appreciate you. She learned to love herself fully, without the need for external validation. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all. That true happiness comes from within. Eleanor found the strength to embrace her flaws, her imperfections, and her unique journey. She stopped apologizing for who she was and started living for herself. The lesson Eleanor's story teaches us is profound. In life, we often find ourselves in situations where we feel unseen, undervalued, or rejected. We may feel as though we are constantly trying to prove our worth to others, whether it be to our families, friends, colleagues, or society at large. We might believe that our value is dependent on their approval, their love, or their recognition. But as Eleanor's journey reveals, true worth is not something that can be given to us by others. It must come from within. We must learn to love ourselves, to accept ourselves for who we truly are, and to stop seeking validation from external sources. In today's world, this lesson is more relevant than ever. We live in a society that often measures our worth based on our achievements, our jobs, and our relationships. Social media, for example, has created an environment where people constantly seek validation from likes, comments, and shares. We are bombarded with messages telling us that our value is determined by how others perceive us. But this external validation is fleeting. It is unreliable, and it will never bring us the lasting happiness we seek. The only way to break free from this cycle is to look inward, to cultivate self-love, and to recognize that we are enough just as we are. If you find yourself struggling with feelings of inadequacy or the need for external validation, take a moment to reflect on Eleanor's story. Ask yourself, what would it look like if you stopped seeking approval from others and started validating yourself? What would it feel like to let go of the need to please others and start living for your own happiness? You are worthy of love, respect, and success, not because of what others think of you, but because of who you are at your core. Embrace the journey of self-discovery, just as Eleanor did. Understand that it is okay to let go of relationships that no longer serve you, and that it is never too late to start anew. Trust in your own abilities and your own worth. The road may be difficult, but the rewards, peace, confidence, and self-love are more than worth the effort. If you found Eleanor's journey inspiring and empowering, and you want to continue receiving content that motivates and uplifts, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support means the world to us and encourages us to keep creating meaningful content. By subscribing, you're not just helping to support the channel, you're also investing in your own personal growth and journey. Thank you for being a part of this community, and we look forward to bringing you even more inspiring stories in the future.